Lion in the Wind, Chapter 2. Bergen leaned back in his chair and studied his proposal. He inhaled deeply, paused, and then let out a long, deep sigh. Persia lay sprawled out on his lap, purring contentedly as she dreamed of romping and playing freely in the tall prairie grasses that surrounded the college. He looked down at her and grinned as he stroked her soft, black and white striped fur. She smiled contentedly and continued dreaming. He felt a pair of hands gently squeeze his shoulders and then pat him on the back. He turned to see Visnel standing behind him smiling. "Is she sleeping?" he whispered. Bergen nodded. "Like a rock," he said quietly. "How's your proposal going?" "I'm having trouble coming up with a good way to say this without sounding silly. How many people do you know of who've actually considered a project like this?" Visnel shrugged. "Not many that I'm aware of. Most see robots as tools, not persons. I can't say I disagree with them either. But I'm going to support you no matter what, because even though I still think you're crazy for even considering something like this, I do see some positive benefits coming from it." Bergen smirked. "Gee, thanks for the support." Visnel waved his hands dismissively. No. Don't misunderstand me here. I like your idea, but I can't think of any practical uses for such an advance in cybernetics. At least not at this time. My main concern is that, since there are no truly discernible practical applications for the technology, the Appropriations Board will likely deny your project request. Although I do have to admit that everything you learn from this experiment will have a profound benefit on other projects across the board, even if yours doesn't have its own direct benefit to society. "But it does," protested Bergen. Visnel crossed his arms, and said, "All right, how so?" "Well, think about it like this. Robots currently do a wide variety of things for us, correct?" Visnel shrugged. "Yeah, that's pretty much a given. All right, now imagine a robot that could think and reason on its own, could go beyond its programming, could learn and adapt, could be truly aware of itself, its environment, and even what others are thinking. What if it could feel sad or happy? What if it could understand your emotions because it had its own? What if its ability to learn and adapt allowed it to foresee trouble we might not and address it before it becomes a problem? I can even see these robots creating great and amazing medical and scientific breakthroughs of their own." "What do you think of that?" said Bergen. Visnel chuckled. "I'd call that a threat to someone's job security. If they can do everything we can do, and do it better, then where would there be any further need for us?" Bergen rubbed his chin in thought. "I can see where you'd make that connection. But my robot will be a lion. How could a lion replace us?" Visnel shrugged. "It's not much of a leap to go from a lion to any of 1,000 other types of androids. Again, I like your idea, but let's at least try not to render ourselves obsolete just yet. Nature's done a great job of getting us this far, so there's no point in rushing ourselves into irrelevance." "So you don't think they'll like my idea?" asked Bergen. Visnel shook his head. "I don't know. Probably not. But that doesn't mean you can't at least try." Bergen looked at the screen on his computer and thought for a moment. "That's what I plan to do." "So, are you going to be there with me when I present it?" "Of course I will. As I said before, no matter how harebrained your idea might be, I'll always stand with you. And I fully plan to keep that promise." Bergen smiled. "Thanks." Visnel shook his head. "Don't thank me. You've earned it. If you hadn't, I probably wouldn't be doing this." Several days later, Dr. Bergen walked into a small conference room on the north side of the college with his proposal tucked securely under his arm, and Dr. Visnel by his side. Persia happily trailed behind them, playfully attacking the two men's feet as though they were some elusive prey that she was hunting. On one side of the room sat a group of 3 directors, 2 men and 1 woman. One of the men gestured to Bergen and Visnel, and said, "Gentlemen, please sit down." Bergen and Visnel obeyed his request and took up seats at a short table directly across from the 3-member board of review. Persia in turn wandered off to play with one of the large plants that adorned the room, much to Bergen's chagrin. As I understand it, You have come here before us today to discuss funding for your proposed sentient robotics project. Am I correct? Asked the one of the men. Bergen nodded. That is correct. Very good. I'm sure you already know the three of us, but just for the record I will introduce each of the members of the review board. I am Director Savage, to my left is Professor Idiv, and lastly we have Dr. Bourne. As is required, we will allow you the normally allotted time for you to promote your project before we make our final decision. But do note that we have already read your entire proposal and strongly disagree with it. So it will be entirely up to you to change our minds. Bergen nodded. He had been through this before and knew the drill. When he would submit a new project for consideration, the review board would initially reject it. It happened to everyone, so he already knew this was coming. Once it was rejected, he would then be required to convince the review board why his proposed project should be allowed to proceed. This was done to ensure that only the most viable or beneficial projects would receive funding so as not to waste the college's limited research funds. It was a harsh system, but a necessary one that weeded out all but the absolutely best projects. Bergen knew his chances of being approved were slim, but he still went on, arguing his case for over 45 minutes before Savage stood up and waved for Bergen to stop. He sighed. Dr. Bergen, he said, pausing briefly as though trying to think of the right words to say. Your presentation is good, and it shows that your project is well thought out and has a lot of merit. However, I can't in good conscience allow you to continue on with what will eventually become a futile effort to sway our initial decision. I admit that you've given us some very convincing arguments for why we should allow you to proceed. But I believe that, even if you continue your presentation to its finale, we will not see anything that will convince us that we should approve your proposal. May I inquire as to why? Asked Bergen. Robots are tools, doctor, and nothing more. They don't need to think. They simply need to do the job that we request of them and nothing more. They certainly don't need emotions, or the ability to form their own thoughts and opinions. But they can become different, said Visnal. And why, pray tell, would you want them to be different? What benefit would they bring to society if they were able to think and reason for themselves? Asked Idiv. They could handle situations that normal robots currently aren't able to, said Bergen. And what about emotions? Of what benefit would they be to a robot? Why would they need to cry? Or even laugh? What if they got angry and went out of control? Emotions in a living being are bad enough. But in a robot, they have the potential to be lethal on a genocidal level. I can't even begin to stress that enough. Emotions are also what makes us uniquely Yigzin. Yet you find it worth giving that away to a machine. I am not giving away our emotions, but rather merely sharing with them what we so blithely take for granted, and yet cherish so deeply, said Bergen. Isn't that the same thing? Bergen shook his head. I don't believe it is. Savage frowned. Well, I do, and I will not let you give away our humanity and what makes us so uniquely different from machines. I'm sorry, but I can't. As such, this meeting is over. There will be no further discussion or debate on this issue, he said. He then turned and stormed out of the room. But how can you? There will be no further discussion on this subject, Dr. Bergen. And that is final, shouted Savage as he exited the small conference room. Bergen said nothing more as he watched Savage leave. He simply stared after him, stunned at what he had just seen and heard. Visnal looked over at Idiv and Bourne, and shouted, Are you just going to let him get away with this? Idiv shook her head. I'm sorry, Dr. Visnal, but I agree with Director Savage. I wish it was different, because I do believe that a lot of good can come from this project. But our society isn't ready for something like this. Maybe in 100 years, but not now. It's too soon. She then turned and hurried out of the room, followed closely by Dr. Bourne. Why those rude, obtuse, ungrateful, incredulous? Dr. Visnal, please. This won't help anything, said Bergen, interrupting Visnal as he fumed acrimoniously. But they. Please, please. This will get us nowhere. It's obvious that we can't change their minds. I saw it in their eyes, said Bergen. You're just going to let this slide, said Visnel in surprise. For now, yes. Visnel studied Bergen for several moments and then gave a devilishly sly grin. You've got something planned, don't you, he said. Not yet. But I know there are ways around the system. I just need to find one and pursue it. Don't worry, I haven't given up on my project just yet. I'll find some way to make it happen. Visnel chuckled. I like how you think. While I may not have supported your project very much in the beginning, after the treatment they gave you today, I'm 100% behind you. Bergen smiled. Thanks. I think I'm going to need some of that support very soon. Just then Persia trotted up to him and sat down at his feet. Are we going home now, Daddy? I'm hungry, she said. Bergen reached down, picked her up and cradled her in his arms. Yes, we're going home now. Who is the grumpy old man? She asked. Bergen chuckled. Someone who needs a nap very badly, he chided. Oh. Do you get grumpy when you don't get enough sleep? Asked Persia. Bergen laughed. I suppose I do. Then will Mr. Viscount, said Persia as she struggled with Visnel's name. Finally she pointed at him and said, him. Does he need a nap too? Visnel laughed. I suppose I do, he said. Bergen chuckled. Come on Persia, let's go home. The next day Bergen came into his office and was surprised to find a letter sitting on his desk with his name written neatly on the front. He opened it and found a business card, and a small piece of paper inside. He took the paper and read it curiously. Just in case you lost your other one, it said. Bergen studied the paper in confusion as he tried to make sense of the somewhat cryptic message. He then looked at the card. It was a plain white business card that read, When you're ready, call me. Below that was a phone number. He flipped it over, but found the other side blank. Puzzled, he pulled a small book off the shelf above his desk and opened it. Inside was pages upon pages of business cards from a variety of people, vendors and organizations he'd met or done business with over the years. He flipped through several pages of the book until he found a card with the same number on it. It was the business card that Farrell Black had given him nearly 10 years earlier. Does his offer of a job still stand, even after all these years? He thought to himself. He shook his head. Impossible. It couldn't be. He began to throw the card away, but then stopped. He looked at the card again, thought for a moment, and soon tucked it in his pocket. During his lunch break he pulled out his mobile phone and dialed the number on the card. The line was quickly answered by a bright, cheerful voice. Cybergenics Incorporated, how may I direct your call? I'd like to talk with Farrell Black, please, said Bergen. I'm sorry, sir, but Mr. Black isn't available right now. He left me his business card, and told me to call him. He did? Would you please read what it says? Bergen read the brief message on the card. One moment, please, said the operator. Hold music began playing. After a minute the operator returned. Sir, Mr. Black would like to talk to you in person. Are you available to meet with him this afternoon at 3? I am. Good. Do you know where our South Igna facility is? Yes, I do. Great. Just go there and show your card to the guards at the gate. They'll point you to where you'll need to go to meet Mr. Black, replied the operator, and then hung up. Bergen put away his phone and proceeded to finish his lunch. Later that day he drove down to the South Igna Cybergenics facility and pulled to a stop at the front gate. Four heavily armed men dressed head to toe in camouflage uniforms eyed him suspiciously as he drove up. Seeing that he intended to go inside, one of them walked over to his car. I'm sorry, sir, but this facility is off limits to the public, he said. Bergen reached into his pocket, pulled out the business card he had been given and handed it to one of the guards. I'm here to see Mr. Black, he said. The guard studied it closely and then handed it back to Bergen. Go down 2 blocks and then turn right, said the guard. Thank you, replied Bergen. He then continued through the gate and across the facility to a short, stout building boldly emblazoned with the Cybergenics logo. Out on the front lawn were dozens of small robots busily doing everything from tending flowers to washing the windows. He parked his car near the front door and then walked into the building. Inside he was greeted by several guards who escorted him over to a small conference room. Once inside he was told to sit down at a large, wooden table in the center. Feral Black entered several minutes later, flanked by an assistant, and sat down across from him. Black folded his hands and smiled beatifically. "Mr. Bergen. It's so good to see you again, even though it's been 10 years, said Black. "Does your offer still stand?" asked Bergen flatly. Black laughed. "Straight into the point. I like that. Yes, my offer still stands, otherwise I would not have sent you my card." He pushed a thick brown folder across the table to Bergen and said, "The terms of your employment are in here. You may take as much time as you like to look them over." Bergen cocked an eyebrow in intrigue. He opened the folder, quickly scanned through the pages, and then closed it a few minutes later. "I will agree to everything in your employment contract, except paragraph 5 on page 2 of document FM-17. Black furrowed his brow in interest. "You read all of that already," he said in muted surprise. Bergen nodded. "You read fast then?" asked Black. Again Bergen nodded. "It's a skill I've acquired over the years in order to absorb as much information as possible in the least amount of time." Black grinned. Impressive." He then took the folder and leafed through the pages until he found the document that Bergen had referred to. He pulled it out, studied it briefly, and then smiled. "Ah, I do see where you might disagree with this." He took a pen from his pocket, scribbled out the paragraph and initialed it. "Then we will simply ignore this stipulation. Is there anything else?" "Yes, one more thing. I will agree to your terms on the condition that you allow me to work on my personal project first," said Bergen. "That won't be a problem, as all projects here are personal projects. I find my scientists to be more creative and productive when they are allowed to work as they see fit." "When can I start?" Black shrugged. "Whenever you like. Then I will begin 2 weeks from Monday." "Agreed," said Black. He pulled a sheet of paper from the folder and pushed it across to Bergen. "Just sign this." Bergen read it quickly and then signed it. Satisfied, Black put the page back into the folder and handed it to his assistant, who quickly took it from the room. "Then we will see you 2 weeks from Monday," he said. Bergen stood, shook Black's hand and then made his way out. Black stood up, turned to the window of the conference room and stared out across the facility. As he did, Bergen's car soon came into view. He watched it slowly drive away as Elgar stepped into the room. "Are the scientists in place?" asked Black. "Ready and waiting." "Good. Make sure that he has everything he needs to begin his project. I want to see this line of his take shape as quickly as possible. What his research yields will be very useful to us." Elgar bowed slightly. "As you wish."